May 29th, 2020, another edition of Jazz Video Guy Live. My special guest today is an old friend. He's a writer, he's a broadcaster, he's a veteran of the New York jazz scene. His name is Ted Pankin. He's going to be joining us in a few minutes from Brooklyn.
Wow.
Whoop, got another computer going there. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, just a few subway stops from Greenwich Village, where one of the great clubs, one of the great hangs in jazz history was located, Bradley's. We're going to talk about Bradley's today, some of the people who played there, and we're also going to talk about some of Ted's other projects, including something he's been working on with Phil Woods, great alto player. Phil's no longer with us, but Ted's going to talk about that project. We're going to look at some video. We're going to start out here with one of the regulars at Bradley's, a pianist who was greatly admired by other pianists and listeners as well. He's been missing, away from us, passed away a number of years ago, but certainly his music is eternal. I'm talking about none other than the great John Hicks. Yeah. Hello, Ted Pankin.
Hello, Brett Premack.
Ted, for those who don't know you, certainly they may have read your work in Downbeat and Jazz Times and in your fantastic blog. Who is Ted Pankin?
Well, that's kind of deep for a first question, right?
Well, this is a deep show, baby.
I am no longer a broadcaster, though it would be fun. But I was a broadcaster for many years. But I'm a working journalist, almost entirely about jazz subjects. I write primarily profiles and feature pieces about musicians. Have done for a number of years. During my time on the radio, I broadcast for 23 years, 1985 to 2008, on a radio station in New York City called WKCR, which some of your audience may know of. The best known person from that station is Phil Schaap, who's been broadcasting there about 50 years, just about. WKCR was a station that had a strong sense of the tradition and history of jazz, thanks very much to Phil Schaap, who is a nonpareil historian and has very profound knowledge of the music. But you basically had an opportunity to do anything you wanted, and I used my slot to document the current scene in New York, kind of like a weekly journal sort of thing. Because so many musicians would be playing in New York in a given week, it was a great way to let them tell their story to the audience and to play new recordings and to a way to focus a show. So many of the interviews that I did during my time at WKCR are on my blog, which is called Today is the Question. I was interested in a very broad range of musical approaches. I had shows with Anthony Braxton and Roscoe Mitchell and George Lewis and Evan Parker. I had shows with Hank Jones and Ahmad Jamal and J.J. Johnson and Ray Brown. And anyway, as part of the journal format, I would often have invite people who are performing at Bradley's in a given week. Now, the Bradley schedule usually ran from Monday through Saturday, and they play 3 sets, a 10 a.m. set, which was a late dinner set, a midnight set, and a 2 a.m. set. So getting people to get to an afternoon show on WKCR after, they'd gotten home at 4 or 5 in the morning could be challenging, but nonetheless, people came up, and because of the show, I would get access to different clubs. So I wound up going to Bradley's a lot because I love jazz piano, and I loved the pianists who played at Bradley's, and it was a lot of fun to hang out there, and it was great room acoustically. And anyway, these days I write for Downbeat, Jazz Times, and Jazz Is magazines. I do, I'm a full service jazz journalist. Or try to be, and I'm still keeping somewhat busy during these more straitened times.
Yeah. Now, Bradley's, in case people don't know, was essentially the premier piano salon in New York City, started by Bradley Cunningham in 1969. Perhaps you could share with us a little bit about Bradley Cunningham, his personality, his size. Who was he?
Well, he was a big guy. He was from California, I believe. I wrote about Bradley's in a piece for Downbeat in 2006 that's on my website, so you can look this up later if you want. The website is called Today is the Question, where you can Google my name and Bradley's and you'll get it. But in any event, he was a brilliant guy, kind of a wild guy. He was in naval intelligence. Apparently, he was in the Pacific Theater during World War II and became fluent enough in Japanese to get prisoners out of their caves in Saipan and come in from the cold, so to speak. Anyway, back in New York, he owned. He went into the bar business. He owned the location that's now the 55 Bar in Greenwich Village, and that was his bar for quite some time. And then in 1969, he came into a space on University Place in the Village, which is about 4 or 5 blocks from the 55 Bar, which is on Christopher Street, east of 7th Avenue. We're dealing with an international audience, so I don't expect everybody to have intimate familiarity with the Village, but it's a neighborhood in Greenwich Village, but it's a neighborhood in downtown New York, kind of bordered by, Houston Street and 14th Street. And ever since the 1950s, really, it's been a center of jazz in New York. The scene moved downtown to Greenwich Village circa 1955, 56, although it never left uptown, of course, but many clubs that are iconic names in the history of jazz formed in the Village, like the Village Vanguard, which has been around since 1934, Cafe Bohemia, a lot of live records there, the 5 Spot, farther east on the Bowery. Later, you had the Blue Note, you had the Jazz Gallery, where Mingus was in residence, many places in the Village, and where many of the people who are legends of the second half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century did their apprenticeships and played their early years.
Yeah.
Greenwich Village and the East Side. So anyway, Bradley came into Bradley's about 2 years. He had a keyboard in there. He booked a lot of guitar bands. Joe Beck played there a lot. And then he got a spinet piano in 71, and he started expanding his policy. It would probably be easier, since I'm an old guy, if I read this, but maybe you don't want that much detail.
No. Don't read anything, please. We'll put a link.
There's a piano bass room.
Yeah.
You want me to stop?
Yep, stop. Because people can, I'll put a link to the article with the video so people can read it. And I highly suggest you read this article, which provides some fantastic detail. So you talked about the pianos. At one point, something happened and Bradley's got a much better piano from someone of renown. What's the story with that, Ted?
Well, Paul Desmond bequeathed his piano to Bradley, so they got very good piano. It was a piano bass room. There was a law in New York that stipulated certain provisions for having drums in a club. So you couldn't have drums at Bradley's until the end of the 80s when that ordinance was struck down. So it specialized as a piano bass drum. And on any given night, you might hear Hank Jones, or you might hear Cedar Walton, or you might hear Kenny Barron, or you might hear Barry Harris. Many, many people. Walter Norris, Roger Kellaway, Dave McKenna, Roland Hanna, George Cables, many, many people. In the late 80s, they started expanding the policy, and drummers started coming in. And that's around when I started going there regularly, and I could sit as close to where the band was playing as I am to my laptop right now. And Idris Muhammad would be there, or Billy Higgins, or Ben Riley. You'd be right in the piano. It was an amazing experience, and it also became, because it was open late, because it had a 2 a.m. set, Bradley's became the place where musicians would come after their gig to hang out, let loose. People would pick up money there from, that people owed them from gigs. People would get gigs there. It was a hang for by hang I mean a gathering place and a meeting spot for the musical elite of hardcore jazz, what I call hardcore jazz in New York City.
Yeah, now because it was a spot where people gathered and hung out, do you think musicians were inspired to play better there?
Well, I like to think that musicians are professional and they bring their all to any situation. But I think there was a particularly inspirational vibe in the room because, well, in the beginning of this piece that I wrote, I remembered a February night in 1992. It was sleeting. It was February. It was the 2 a.m. set. There were maybe 18 people, 20 people in the room. Stephen Scott was playing, pianist Stephen Scott, who you know well from his time with Sonny Rollins, your friend and mine. And he was there behind his first recording on Verve, and he had Ray Drummond and Ben Riley with him. Pretty great for a 21-year-old pianist. Among the 18 or 20 people in the room were Tommy Flanagan, Kirk Lightsey, Ronnie Matthews, Don Pullen, and Cecil Taylor. That was
Wow.
that was not unrepresentative. And I remembered this just because it made such an impression on me. And when I wrote the article 13, 14 years later, it just came to mind. That was what it was like. By around 1990, Bradley Cunningham's widow, Wendy Cunningham, who had the club, was booking a lot of young musicians who were coming to town. Christian McBride did some of his first gigs at Bradley's. Roy Hargrove did some of his first gigs at Bradley's. Jeff Keezer was introduced to New York at Bradley's. Danilo Perez was playing there. Jackie Terrison, Eric Reed. I mean, just really anybody you can think of who started emerging circa 1990. Many of them were playing at Bradley's. Benny Green, Mike LeDunn had gigs there. There were Peter Washington was there all the time. Lewis Nash was booked there all the time. I mean, every week it was like, like a band that might be touring the festival circuit in Europe. So I don't know if they necessarily made them play better, but it certainly made everybody mind their P's and Q's. I mean, several pianists describe a kind of rooting section. Let's say Harold Mabern, Ronnie Matthews would be at the bar, and somebody would be playing a standard, and well, no, don't forget the bridge. Oh, no, play this over here. Don't forget. It was the so there was a that aspect was involved, although usually with love and respect, of course.
Yeah. Now, one of the elders of the scene at Bradley's was Hank Jones, and we want to play some Hank Jones video right now and come back, and Ted's going to talk about his experience with Hank Jones.
I did. That happened during a tour that I did with Benny Goodman Orchestra, and many years ago. And when I first got to Japan, I was really very much impressed by the magnificence of the city, the buildings, the architecture. The people were wonderful, very warm and friendly. When I got off the plane, the first thing I heard was from a friend, a kid who worked for USIA. He was living in Japan, but the first thing I heard when I got off the plane was "Welcome home," and that impressed me very much, and it just sort of opened up, made the whole thing sort of nice, wonderful. I enjoyed it. I have working for me. I'm very fortunate to have working for me two very fine young musicians. On the bass, Mr. David Wong, who is an exciting bass player and a revelation to me because I'd never heard his work prior to this time. Very good, very good. And also on the drums, Mr. Billy Kilson, who has been in Japan, I guess, for quite a while. He told me he had played Blue Note so many times, he can't remember how many times. But he's a very exciting drummer, very good playing backgrounds, and a very good soloist. Excellent. So I had one of the great groups that I worked with.
Turn the audio back on. Hank Jones was a man of great taste and elegance. He was the elder brother of Thad and Elvin, and played with just about everybody from Charlie Parker to Jackie Gleason. He was the first African-American staff musician at CBS. He was actually the pianist on the Ed Sullivan Show for many years. He played at Marilyn Monroe's infamous Happy Birthday, Mr. President appearance at Madison Square Garden for John Kennedy. And he played many times at Bradley's, right?
One of the first African-American musicians in the studios in New York. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Jeff.
I was going to ask you if you had seen Hank at Bradley's.
Sure. Yeah. Well, he did. There's one of my favorite records of his is a record on the Dutch label Timeless, which is no longer existent, but had a run for about a decade. It's a duo with Red Mitchell, and it happened right after they did a week at Bradley's, and I remember being there that week. It was a particularly effervescent week, and I think, Hank Jones was an idol of mine from when I first started listening to jazz. Maybe the record that got me was Something Else, the Cannonball Adderley one-off record for Blue Note, where Hank, Sam Jones, and Art Blakey are the rhythm section with Cannonball and Miles. It's just every note is perfect, but he was in the studios all these years, and then in 1975, after he left the studios, he just started making dozens of records, mostly trio, but some duo and solo, many for Japanese labels. He did a number of records with Ron Carter and Tony Williams under the title Great Jazz Trio. But I mean, I just loved his playing. He was so funny. He was so witty. There was something. He was so, as he said, elegant, and just a sparkling, intelligent guy. And his appearances at Bradley's were highlights. You know, the piano community would turn out. I got to meet Hank the first time in 1994. He was doing a gig at Sweet Basil, a quintet gig. I had Tom Harrell, and I can't remember who the saxophone player was. It might have been Ralph Moore, but I'm not sure. In any event, he joined me on WKCR. He was just wonderful to talk to, really, really funny, really sharp, very incisive. And then 12, 13 years later, I had an assignment to write about him for Jazz Is, a feature piece. And I went to see him at the place he was staying, which wasn't home. He had just gotten through some pretty severe medical problems. And the interview went well and the piece went well. And he approached me then to work with him on writing a memoir that he'd been thinking of doing. So we got together and did a couple of very long interviews about his formative years. But then, unfortunately, that memoir just couldn't get off the ground. He got very busy because he had, unfortunately, severe financial obligations, and he had to keep working up until 90, 91, really, when he shouldn't have had to been working like that.
Yeah, well, the financial obligations were supporting his wife, who was in a nursing home at that time. You know, one of our viewers here points out an article that appeared in the New York Times, I guess a year or so before Hank passed, where it described his living conditions as rather meager. Was he under great financial stress?
Well, I didn't get that personal with him, but he was living in a room. I don't know how deeply I want to go into it. He was living in a room in a comfortable apartment with people who were taking good care of him. One in particular, and he had a piano, but it was distressing, and this is where we did the interviews. I don't know how much more I can really say about it.
Well, that's okay. That's cool. I wanted to ask you about when. Oops, I'm out of focus. There I am. When Hank appeared on the Musician Show, I met Hank. I guess in the late 70s, he was the pianist on the Broadway show Ain't Misbehavin'.
Yeah.
And I went to the theater, to his dressing room, and hung out with him for a couple hours. And when we started talking about the piano, immediately he was talking about Tatum. He said the first time he heard Tatum, so he was in another room, somebody was playing the music in the next room, he thought it was two pianists. I mean, he was just really blown away by Tatum. Ted, what did you learn about Hank from doing the musician show with him?
It wasn't a musician show, it was just a regular interview, but what I learned, well, Hank was born in Mississippi, but his parents migrated north to Pontiac, Michigan in 1918. They obviously survived the influenza epidemic of that year. And his father was a church deacon who played guitar. His mother was primarily a domestic, but they had a piano in the house. He had an older sister who was a good piano player, and he learned through her pretty much, and then he started having lessons later. He was 5 years older than Thad Jones, and he was 9 years older than Elvin. So I'm sure, so there was that distance apart. He started gigging seriously around 1934, with local bands in around Pontiac and Grand Rapids, Michigan. He didn't really spend that much time in Detroit, although he was, classified as one of the Detroit pianists. But he didn't spend that much time in Detroit. He had about 8-month period there around 1942, 43. And his influences were Tatum, Teddy Wilson greatly, Nat Cole for sure, although he was only a couple of years younger than Nat Cole. In any event, he made his way. In 1944, he decided that he was going to go to New York, and as part of that process, he took a gig in Buffalo. And Ray Brown happened to be on that gig. Ray Brown was coming off of which band? Was it the Nat Tolles band? Snookum Russell maybe. In any event, they were playing at a spot in Buffalo, maybe a 4 or 5 month gig. And for a couple of weeks, Art Tatum was playing across town. So they'd go every night and hang out with Tatum and watch Tatum, and Tatum would play often after the set. He'd go to somebody's house and he could play till 6, 8, 10 in the morning. So Hank got immersed in Tatum, and then he went to New York and pretty quickly got gigs on 52nd Street. I see that note. He used to help Tatum get around, right? Yeah, he would hang out with him. So he became pretty busy, and he met Monk, for example. I think probably met Monk when Monk was playing with Coleman Hawkins on 52nd Street, maybe. Monk showed him Monk's Mood at his house after the set one night. He heard Bud Powell very early on, and he applied himself to learning the new language of the time, the new piano language, bebop. So in a very unique way, he assimilated he bridged the older and the newer styles and created his own very singular and very sparkling vocabulary and argot, and made some of the most enduring and must-hear recordings of the piano canon. Yeah. Oscar Peterson was deeply influenced by Hank. He went on jazz at the Philharmonic. I guess Norman Granz started using him in 1947-48, and he was Ella Fitzgerald's accompanist on JATP. So that, of course, expanded his visibility. That may have led to the first session he did with Bird, which was a one-off in 1947, I think. I think he made maybe one other session on, I can't remember. One of the listeners may know.
Yeah, and also Hank did I think it was 51 or 52, with Gian Mill, did a video with Bird that came out a few years ago on a laser disc and a DVD, a VHS, called Improvisation. So Hank was definitely part of the bebop world, and someone else who was part of the bebop world, a student of Bird, was Phil Woods. And we're going to... Good segue. So before we talk about Phil Woods, let's check out a little bit of Phil Woods on alto.
Well, now, like I said before, you were a big influence on me, but your influences were like the masters, like Benny Carter, Johnny Hodges, Charlie Parker.
Well, I heard Bird when I was 13 years old, about my first record. And my first alto player I saw was Johnny Hodges with Duke Ellington's band. But in retrospect, my hero today is Benny Carter. I came to Benny Carter late, but I admire him so much because not much notoriety, but he writes trumpet, alto, arranger, and he's still out there at 82. So this is my real hero, of those three you mentioned. Yeah,
really. Well, speaking of Charlie Parker and the bebop scene, you toured with Dizzy Gillespie in the 50s. You went to Europe, right?
Well, our first tour actually was a Mid-East tour. I think when the American government gets nervous, they always send Dizzy to try to cool it out. Our first port of call was Abadan, Iran. I don't think there's going to be too many bands following in our footsteps. We played Beirut, Lebanon.
They're not going to be opening a Blue Note there.
Damascus, Aleppo, Syria, Baghdad. We had all the spots that are now trouble spots. I think if they sent Dizzy one more time, it might have cooled out all this trouble we're in right now.
That's a good idea.
It's a great idea.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the tune that we're going to
The tune is composed by Ann Rennell.
It's standard.
It's an old standard. I don't know exactly when. I would guess in the late 20s, 1930s. We've done a little waltz arrangement on it, and it's called Willow Weep for Me.
Let's do it.
Let's hit it.
All right.
yeah. That was Willow Weep for Me from David Sanborn's great late night show, Night Music, with Mr. Sanborn and Phil Woods taking care of some serious business there. I loved at the, excuse me, at the end of Sanborn solo, how Phil just picked right up what he was doing. Just fantastic. So Ted sent me, I guess it's a draft of a book he's working on of Phil Wood's memoirs. Can you talk to us about that project, Ted? It's really fantastic.
It's a bit. I know I've been talking too long every time I've been speaking. This is going to take a minute or two to give you a context.
No problem.
Pardon me? Okay. It's pretty funny in retrospect how I got involved and embroiled with Phil. Of course, I always knew his music. One of the first records I ever got was Rites of Swing, which he did for Candid Records. Nat Hintoff produced it, like in 1961, 5-part suite for large ensemble, and it was really the only record that displayed his arranging and orchestrational talents and compositional talents for the larger unit until the 90s. And that happened shortly after he had come back from Europe, where he was with Quincy Jones for an ill-fated musical that involved many adventures. So, of course, I always knew who Phil Woods was, but I never met him until sometime in the 80s. During the 80s, for reasons I won't go into, I was trying to write a long kind of scholarly history of jazz on the south side of Chicago. And Bud Johnson was somebody I wanted to talk to. Bud Johnson was playing at Sweet Basil. I used to live on Bleecker Street and Thompson, and I had been at the Village Vanguard that night, and I was walking home down 7th Avenue, sorry for all the geographical detail, and through the window of Sweet Basil I saw Bud Johnson, who was playing there. And I had probably had one too many, so I just decided to go in and introduce myself to Bud Johnson, which wasn't the best idea, but it was the only thing I could think of at the time. The gentleman he was with, who had a mustache, had a leather cap, not unlike what you just saw, told me to get the hell out of there, get out of his face, otherwise he was going to, he would take matters into his own hands. So I left, tail between my legs. That was Phil. That was my first encounter with Phil. Fast forward maybe 20 years, I have a job from Downbeat for their 70th anniversary, and the assignment was to interview a bunch of saxophone players for some words on their favorite saxophone player. Charles McPherson had Bird. So I thought I would call Phil and ask him about either Johnny Hodges or Benny Carter. Phil didn't want to talk about either of those people. He wanted to talk about Harvey LaRose, who you may not have heard of unless you're from Springfield, Massachusetts, or have read Phil's many essays and columns that he published over the years. That was Phil's first teacher, obviously a master musician who never left Springfield. And Phil wanted to talk about him, and he did. I told him, well, I'd love to hear all about it, but Downbeat probably wasn't going to go for it. They probably wouldn't want to run it, and sure enough, they didn't. When that happened, Phil and I had to call Phil and tell him. He gave me a piece of his mind, and he sent out a note to his email list that Ted Pankin and Downbeat weren't allowing him to do this, and he used some pretty salty language in there. He was told by a couple of people in his band, or suggested to him, who were friends of mine, that maybe he should retract that, and he did. So that was my second encounter with Phil. So when Downbeat gave me an assignment to write a cover story about him a couple of years later, I had some second thoughts about it, but I decided why not. And it was at the International Association of Jazz Educators conference, and he was and he was being interviewed by Nat Hentoff. And I introduced myself afterwards, and we went across the street to his hotel. And as soon as we got into the elevator, his face turned pale. He turned ashen. He turned gray. Now, Phil had emphysema, serious emphysema. He had to carry, by this time, 2007, he was 76, and he had to carry an oxygen tank with him. We got into the room. He, he got onto the tank, and then he was fine. And we talked for a couple of hours. The conversation went very nicely, and at the end of the conversation, I told him about my past encounters with him, which he did not remember, and he cracked up, and he apologized, and 2 years later, he approached me about working with him on this memoir, which he was putting together out of these various articles that he had been writing for, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of it, but it was involved with he lived in the Delaware Water Gap in New Hope, in New Hope, Pennsylvania, where the what's the name of that club? The Delaware Water Gap. Some people are gonna be mad at me for not remembering this. In any event, so he sent me the chapters, and I looked at them, and some of the writing was very good, but it needed a lot of tightening up. And I thought there needed to be some additions, so I interviewed him 7 or 8 times. We did a number of long interviews, and I incorporated those interviews into the text. And finally, unfortunately, Phil passed away in 2013. Deerhead, that's what it is. It's the Deerhead, of course. And he didn't get to see the final edition, but it's coming out this summer. It's called My Life in E Flat, and it will be coming out on Symbol Press, which you can find on the internet, and you can pre-order if you're interested. But I said it wasn't really a draft; it was more like final galleys or close to final galleys.
Well, I found it to be one of those books where once I started it, I didn't want to put it down. The combination of the stories and your writing, I highly recommend it. I think a lot of people are going to develop a new appreciation of Phil Woods. People in the jazz scene know about Phil being outspoken, his personality. Those who are listeners know that he could swing like crazy, fantastic alto player. So certainly a memoir that I highly recommend.
Yeah. Well, more than swing like crazy, he was a rare combination. He was like the first call studio alto player in the studios in New York when there was a significant studio scene. He made thousands of records. He could take, one solo chorus on Billy Joel's I Want You Just the Way, whatever the name of that song is.
Just the Way You Are.
Right, which he probably got more recognition for than anything else he did. But then, and then in his bands, as you say, he was like a hard-blowing, hard-swinging player. But he also was an extraordinarily witty and in-the-moment player. So he combined that immaculate technique and sound, and throughout the registers, with extreme quick-wittedness and improvisational feeling. That's not a common combination, to be the lead player in a section and then have those improvisational chops. It's similar, I guess, for trumpet players. And his band. I attended a record session by one of his final bands, although not the final one, with Brian Lynch on trumpet, Bill Charlap, Steve Gilmore, and Bill Goodwin. And they hadn't rehearsed any of the music. They basically read off the charts, or didn't even read off the charts. They just basically gave each other oral instructions. Everything was 1 or 2 takes, and the record was a masterpiece. I think it was called American Songbook. I can't remember if it was Volume 1 or Volume 2. So it was he was a very generous guy. He taught. He taught at a camp in Pennsylvania called Ramblurny, where Randy Brecker went. Mike Brecker was there, Steve Grossman, the late Richie Cole. All of them studied under him at that place. And he, among other people who studied with him who are currently on the scene, are Vincent Herring and John Gordon. And there are others. I think he's a somewhat misunderstood figure. although misunderstood by whom. He has so many he had so many fans and a huge fan base. So it was a great privilege to be able to work on a project with someone like him. And I think most of the text in the book is his words. I just tightened things up and shaped it and used certain editorial prerogatives, I guess you could say.
Well, certainly, as I mentioned, the book is great, highly recommended. I couldn't put it down. That's kind of a cliche, but it's the truth. And somehow we've burned through an hour here rather quickly with Ted.
Can I say another word or two about Bradley's?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we didn't mention John Hicks's exalted position in the rotation of Bradley's. There was something very special about any time he played at Bradley's. He would just lift the room. It became like this. I don't want to use the word church, but it had a very spirit-raising atmosphere, which was captured in the video that you played. What he could do. Sometimes it would be with Idris Muhammad, Walter Booker, sometimes Ray Drummond, sometimes other. Victor Lewis would also play with John. Well, a number of people. And so in any event, I just wanted to mention that. I met my wife at Bradley's actually after a third set by him on a Saturday night in August 1991. So that's another special association that I have with John.
Ted, what is the title of the book?
My Life in E Flat.
My Life in E Flat. Well, Ted, we could go on here probably for days. I want to thank you for joining us on Jazz Video Guy Live today. What's your next piece coming out in print in Downbeat or Jazz Times or Jazz Is?
I'm not sure. I'm working on I probably should not say the piece that I'm working on right now. It's on a pianist who was a contemporary of Nat Cole and very influential and great pianist and there's a big reissue series of about a dozen albums that he did in the 60s and 70s. So I'm going to write about various dimensions of this series and this guy's life and his work. And I'm going to start writing a column for a magazine on anything I want, one of the magazines.
Sounds good. Ted, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to go out here with some Phil Woods, everybody.
Next week,
What's that?
who do you have next week?
Next week we have Steve Wilson. We have Rolf Peterson on Wednesday. And I forget who we have on Friday.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
It's okay. So we're going to go out with some Phil Woods here. We want to thank Ted Pankin. We will have Ted back again real soon.
Okay,
And
that'd be great.
please check out his book. And I put the link to the Bradley's article into the comments of this video. You can refresh the page afterwards to check it out. You can check out Ted's writing, which I've been a fan of for many years.
Thank you, Brett. And